The third round will make or break drafts this year. That's what we're going to talk about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. And Shawn, we've been talking for a little bit. You had the great take that I agree with, that the first round this year in drafts probably extends beyond the first 12 picks, or there are more than 12 first round players. There are maybe about 16 on FFPC with the tight end premium format, where you have Brock Bowers and Trey McBride in that group. There's one more guy that we were talking about earlier today, you and I, that maybe actually makes that 17 that we'll talk about a little bit on this show. But there's a pretty big tier break there around 204, maybe in tight end premium. Maybe it's a little earlier in non-tight end premium for some people if those tight ends don't belong inside that group, although Brock Bowers probably does in most formats. And then the second half of the second round feels a little bit weaker. It feels a little bit flatter. And then really you get into the third round and it gets really tough. And for those who were listening to the RotoViz radio show, I had an opportunity to jump on with the executive producer of our podcast here, Stealing Bananas, Colin Kelly, your co-host over at Overtime, RotoViz Overtime, that me and Colin don't get a chance to jump on with each other very often, but we got a chance to kick you out and have fun this week and talk a little bit. And he had me name my favorite player in each round. When I got to the third round, I actually just cheated and picked a guy who had an ADP of 403 that I was pulling up into the third round, because it is a tricky round for a variety of reasons. I'm looking at an FFPC ADP list right now that starts with Chase Brown at 301, goes T. Higgins, Kyren Williams, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Rashee Rice, Breece Hall, Garrett Wilson, JSN, Tyreek Hill, Jayden Daniels, Marvin Harrison. So you get three quarterbacks in there, the first three. And that's, I think, right there, indication enough that drafters are saying, hey, this is kind of a flat area, and we're going to be bringing up quarterbacks. We have Lamar Jackson, we have Josh Allen, we have Jayden Daniels. You get three running backs that we've talked through a little bit, I think, Shawn. We've spent a lot of time talking through the best profiles, I think, this year. Chase Brown, Kyren Williams, Breece Hall. We've talked through some concerns with some of those profiles there. And then the receivers, there's six of them. T. Higgins, Rashee Rice, who's really moving up and starting to create some distance between him and Xavier Worthy. You have Garrett Wilson, you have Jackson Smith and Jigba, Tyreek Hill, Marvin Harrison. A lot of profiles there that are tricky. The young ones, the three Ohio State wide receivers there, Garrett Wilson, Jackson Smith and Jigba, and Marvin Harrison, for a variety of reasons for Garrett Wilson, you have Justin Fields at quarterback. For JSN, you got a whole new offense in place. For Harrison, the tough rookie year. What do we think about him? They're profiles that we really liked, but they're not necessarily profiles that going into 2025 are fun to click on in a really meaningful way. Even, Shawn, stretching into the late second round, as I said, after that tier break, you have a lot of names that are tricky. And then that continues into the early fourth as well. Devontae Adams, the next name off. James Cook, the next name off. James Cook apparently may actually legitimately hold out. I mean, I don't think the CBA really allows for that, but if he misses all of the offseason and then tries to show up week one, doesn't feel great to be taking him at 402. Devontae Adams.
We got two very different results from vaguely that type of thing last year with Jamar Chase and Brandon Ayuk.
Yeah, exactly. The Ayuk thing would be the concern situation. The Chase thing, I guess, didn't really affect
it. Worked out all right.
It worked out okay. But yeah, this round 3 area is very fascinating. That late round 2 area is fun to talk through, is worth talking through, is something that, as we had a long pre-show discussion again today that broke into 2 parts, and it's been a long pre-show process. We thought maybe the best thing to crystallize today is a few targets in this range that is just very, very flat after you get past the early second round names of guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Brian Thomas, Devon Achane, Nico Collins. Once those probably first round profiles going early in round 2, once those are off the board, a lot of people are going to have their own favorites. Let's put it that way. And it's a tricky way. It's an important It's a tricky area of the draft. It's going to be very, very important. It's going to make or break drafts, as I said at the top, because it's going to be very, very important to get this area right.
It is. And I've written up a big piece on the MFL 10 of Death that really is more a breakdown of 45 guys, right? The player I think is the best pick in each round, explaining my picks. I hope that they're somewhat controversial and at least fun. And then the most controversial pick. And so you get, 45 guys that way if you go through essentially round 15. And similar to doing the big gorilla pieces, I'm forcing myself to really look behind sort of my knee-jerk reaction to these 45 players. I mean, it's fun, Ben. I've been having so much fun with fantasy this year. It's been so much fun to talk with you, talk with Colin, and then to do some of these pieces where there are lots of occasions where trying to figure out something that would in some tiny way enhance the experience or the performance for readers, as opposed to just giving them exactly what, we kind of already know that's out there. Not that I know what's out there as much as many people do, but going through that, I end up learning a lot. I felt like round 3 was terrible. Not that the drafters were doing a bad job, but just every pick I'm looking at and I hate that pick for round 3. I was saying in a lot of ways I liked round 4 better, just straight up. And then looking at the running backs in rounds 4 and 5, I liked round 5 better at running back. And one of the things that I think how that kind of all works together is that when we're on the clock making some of these early decisions, it's about individual player evaluation. It's also about how am I going to build my roster out? And regardless of whether you're doing a best ball, like the MFL 10 of Death is, and that one kind of interesting because it's just a full season scoring, right? You're not worried about some of these things that occur in tournaments, like how can I just score the most points? All the way to building out the main event teams that you and I have been doing. There are different things you're trying to do, but you're certainly trying to build a team that is coherent. There are lots of builds that will work, but you need to have some internal consistency. Well, if I'm looking at the round 3 wide receivers and saying this is bleak, but then I'm looking at the options that people took in round 4 at running back and saying the round 5 running backs are simply better, you've got to go somewhere. Now, one of the things you can do is just take a guy from rounds 4 and 5. Some of the things we talked about pre-show were about how a lot of the things that are happening are probably more informational cascades than a true wisdom of crowds, in that the ADP value element of things is overhyped for reasons that we won't get into on this show, may talk about in the future. I think a lot of listeners understand kind of why we feel that way. But regardless, you got to make a pick, right? So one of the things that I did to try and check myself and see if maybe I was just way out of calibration was to pull up the RotoViz screener and build a simple model with receiving stats and age, draft status, what have you. One of the amazing things about this tool that the Fantasy Juice built all those years ago is that in addition to being able to pull all kinds of cool stats, you can build yourself a simple model, right? Now, I'm not saying that this model answers all of the questions. I certainly don't think it is going to give you answers that are nearly as strong as what you and Mike are doing on your projection shows. But I wanted to know, stripped of a bunch of nuance, a bunch of context that fantasy drafters might actually have, that the machine is not going to have. What are the baselines for these guys if we look at how it kind of works with how scoring has happened in the last 15 years when guys had these profiles coming in? And the answer was that I wasn't as poorly calibrated as I was concerned I might be. The screener also hated these picks in round 3, which again, I don't think that means that the picks are wrong, that they're bad, or that you can just abstain from making a round 3 selection. But I do think it goes back to this original, kind of framing of the conversation, which is that round 3 is a very different animal than those guys, who are going in the first 16, 17 picks. The fall off in value is absolutely huge. Now, to give you a few names before I throw it back, some of the guys that the model really didn't like were guys like Terry McLaurin, who's actually coming off of a really good season. I think if the model knew more about the background, it'd be even more skeptical. Didn't like DJ Moore. I mean, hated Marvin Harrison, but the second-year guys are always trickier when you throw them into a model that includes everybody. Didn't like Mike Evans. Obviously hated Tyreek Hill, who just had a terrible season last year. Would be a little bit different if it was a multi-year model. Hated Devontae Adams, not knowing that Devontae Adams is now going to be stepped on by Puka Nacua. You go through all of that, and especially then, say, once T. Higgins and Chase Brown are off the board to the beginning, once Rashee Rice is off the board to the beginning, you are into this range where there are not a lot of picks that are straightforward. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be a 1, 2, or even a handful of picks that end up being very valuable and especially related to the other guys you might have selected instead.
Some of those guys that you mentioned are more third-round picks, like on Underdog. They're going in the fourth round on FFPC, but it's going to be the same sort of discussion. The way, they're a little bit different names than some of the ones that I read off at the beginning. But we've talked about when we went through our drafts, when I was with Calm earlier this week and did a favorite pick from each round, got a chance to talk about sort of the fifth and sixth round as being on FFPC, being really favorable for wide receivers. That's maybe more like the fourth and fifth on Underdog. But I think it's fascinating that you had kind of done that background and sort of built up that model and found that conclusion. I think one of the big things when you get into this tier and into this group, when you're picking in the third round or the fourth round, you have two players. This is your third most important player, ostensibly, or your fourth or your fifth as you get into the fourth and the fifth round, right? These picks are massively important to your build. Any fantasy draft that you're doing, you're thinking, I need to shoot for some ceiling. I need to have a build that can win at minimum this league. In some of the best ball stuff, you're talking about broader contests, what have you. So I either need to be the top 1 out of 12, or maybe you're in a 10-team league with top 1 out of 10 or whatever. But these are still going to be in a 10-team league. These might be more like fifth-round picks. But this tier, this group is still going to be very vital to get right in even a smaller league than 12 teams. But especially, you get into a little bit of a larger team, you get into a larger contest, you got to get these early picks right. They got to score a lot of points for you. They're super important. And in the third round, Shawn, later this summer, we'll do our first and second round of 2026 ADP. It'll be this year. The guys that we think will define next offseason's top 2 rounds. When you get into these rounds, when you're picking in round 3, you want guys that can finish at the top of their position. I mean, it's not far enough into the draft. You may not have the very best profiles because there is a tier break there in round 2, but you have to be able to tell yourself a story that the player that you're drafting in the third round can finish. Maybe if in a rare situation, if it's not the number 1 player at his position, then it's at least top 5, that he can give you first round value and then probably be viewed as a first or second round pick the next year, even though he's not going in the first or second round this year. It can't just be I think he's good enough to justify this ADP or score enough points for, and that sort of thing. Like, take Garrett Wilson, for example, a guy who I really, really like. And I did my Jets projection, and I came out a little bit more intrigued by Garrett Wilson in that projection than I would have been going in. They have no other receivers. They've signed Josh Reynolds, and they're talking about him as being meaningful. They still have Alan Lazard on the team. They brought in this Arian Smith rookie. Malachi Corley did nothing. They brought in the rookie tight end, Mason Taylor. They got the running backs. Most importantly, Justin Fields is their quarterback, who I've talked about in the past. The combination of his dropbacks that are rushes or sacks, very, very high. Those are the 2 outcomes that don't become a pass attempt. So even by called pass rate, which tends to be lower on Justin Fields' teams because he's going to have some designed runs himself. This is a team that has a really good running back group. They're talking about it being the best running back group in the league, and they just have a defensive coordinator just took over as the new head coach. They're probably going to be a little more run-based than especially when you start talking about Fields and you start talking about the things that they're saying about how he brings a different dimension to the game, and they can create a multifaceted run game, that this is going to be a run-based team. But even just So if the called run rate is low, that's a problem. But even if the called run rate is whatever, average, a smaller percentage of the actual called passes are going to be pass attempts because of Fields' tendency to hold the ball, take sacks at a high rate, scramble at a high rate. He has, over the last couple of years, been better about that. Last year in the 6-game sample with the Steelers, his sack rate and his scramble rate were both career lows, and they added up to 18.3% of his dropbacks. A few years ago when I talked about this number, it was 28.4% in 2022. The 18.3% is still very high. That's about where most of the rookie QBs were last year. This is one of the reasons the people talk about rookie QBs can't sustain offenses. They have a tendency to either take sacks at an elevated rate or scramble a little bit of an elevated rate because it's hard to read out defenses at the next level. Your first opportunity to see them. And we see that with mobile quarterbacks. They run more early in their career and their rushing tends to fall off a little bit as they get more comfortable playing the position.
Now, do you think there's any potential for that number to spike again once you're out of a Pittsburgh situation where they seemed like they felt like the whole team was good enough to have a good team? Now, this obviously didn't really work out in the end when they started losing with Russell Wilson, but they just put the handcuffs on him in every way, not really letting him throw, but also not encouraging him to be aggressive running. And the Jets are just going to be more aggressive. And they're like, yeah, go get 1,000 rushing yards.
He was also under 20% in 2023 when DJ Moore had the big year. He was at 19.0%, the combined of those two factors. As a rookie, it was 23.5%. It had jumped to 28% in year 2. I think he's probably going to be somewhere between the high teens and into the 20s, probably the low 20s. I don't think he'll be in the high 20s again. That was the really bad year. But the other year he was also below 20% was in Chicago. But just like for reference, there's not many other QBs that are even in the high teens. So like that was where Lamar Jackson was at his career highs, where his scramble rates were at the highest, but his scramble rate was actually down last year. As those guys have gotten further in their career, other mobile guys, their scramble rates tend to dip a little bit. For Fields, it's also dipped, but it's dipped now to like where the rookies always wind up being, which is still tricky. That's his like better number is still tricky.
Now, I'm interested in hearing how high you were able to get this, because there's obviously a difference between a projection and a high end outcome, which is what I think we got from DJ Moore a couple of years ago. But Moore hit the 29% target share, which I would be surprised if Garrett Wilson isn't over 30. And as a result, he got 138 targets and 1,364 receiving yards. Again, when you're talking about median outcomes versus ceiling outcomes, it's a different story. But are we looking at a context where Garrett Wilson can get in that vicinity? And if he does hit a ceiling outcome, even blow by it?
Well, that's the thing, and that's kind of where I was going with it. Is I have a hard time with Garrett Wilson in the third round because I did put his baseline at a 29% target share because there's such a lack of competition, and I do think when they do throw, they'll probably do some of the like RPO stuff, which tends to lead to more targets for the wide receiver one. That's something we've talked about over the last couple of years. We've done some research on, written about over at the newsletter. And so I do think the targets will be very concentrated on Wilson, and maybe the 29% target share for him that you mentioned that Moore also matched. And that's why I think the number for Fields 2 years ago in Chicago is very interesting, because that's the year that Moore had the really good year. I do think that number may even be low, like you're saying. Maybe he'll be over 30%. You said you would be surprised if he wasn't, and he very well could be. I got him to 142 targets. You mentioned 138. So basically in that same range. I'm basically projecting Garrett Wilson to have a similar year to what DJ Moore did 2 years ago, except you said 1,300 plus yards. I only have him quite a bit below that in terms of what his efficiency has been pretty low with a lot of different quarterbacks. Wilson, so far
it's been extraordinarily low. There's no other good player in the last 20 years who has FPOE numbers in the receiving game like Garrett Wilson. There are bad players, but even then, it's just apples and oranges because he has so much negative efficiency on so much volume. It's just a completely unique profile to this point.
Yeah.
Because
it's hard to know whether that's him. Yeah. It's hard to know whether it's him or it's the QBs, right? Moore coming over from Carolina, his last 2 years of Carolina, his yards per target was 7.1, 7.5. And then his first year in Chicago that we're talking about, he's at a 10.0 yards per target. His per target efficiency spiked, as a result of that type of an offense, which one of the things about the efficiency is when you're in an offense like this, it was something that happened with Russell Wilson with like Tyler Lockett back in the day where he'd take a lot of sacks. If you're taking a lot of sacks, you're not throwing the low probability catch, the lowest probability passes on the spectrum. You're not releasing those passes into tight windows that are probably going to go for incompletions. With other quarterbacks, they may throw them at, towards your feet or whatever, throw them over your head a little bit. Some of those don't get classified as targets because they're just throwaways, but a lot of them still, there's a sliding scale there. A lot of them still will get classified as a target, even though they're a very low probability pass.
So it's going to wash out some of these plays that are the scrambles or the sacks that you're talking about.
Right. The efficiency has to spike as a result of those low probability passes not actually going out. And so it washes, like you said, it will wash out some of those plays because the ones that actually get thrown are the ones where Garrett Wilson wins and he's wide open. And then that ball gets thrown, and so that's a high efficiency play at that point in the play, whether, the throw is a perfectly accurate throw or he catches it or whatever, still has a little variance to it. But you're going to get in the sample, the plays you're going to get removed by some of these sacks and scrambles are the weakest for efficiency. So that should have a positive effect on his efficiency. Maybe I'm a little light on his efficiency. The point is, even with 140 targets, a little bit of efficiency issue. I can't give him a massive touchdown rate because this offense doesn't project to have a very strong win total, or like the team doesn't project to, they don't project to score a lot of points by the look ahead lines or any of these elements. And so as far as the way that I do the projections, it's hard for me to project a team that looks like it's going to be one of the weaker offenses in the league. They're going to be a defensive focused team if they do win games to score a bunch of touchdowns. Again, I think they're going to be a pretty running back focused team. So when they do score touchdowns, I think it's going to be more or less through those guys and probably through Justin Fields rushing for some TDs on this team, right? So I don't think Justin Fields is going to be your 40 touchdown passing guy. I don't know that he's going to be a 30 touchdown passing guy. A baseline projection for me is actually at 19.1 passing TDs, just a little bit more than one per game passing in addition to some rushing TDs. And that gives him some viability as a QB. The point I'm trying to make is Garrett Wilson, through all this with a 29% target share and a lot of, trying to see some ceiling scenarios and things and thinking through it, the structures of the offense and the way that Justin Fields exists, it just makes it a really hard third round pick, even as a big time Garrett Wilson fan, that I don't see how that works. And I think you can make similar cases across this round. I think you can make a similar case about Marvin Harrison. A lot of people will say, well, he's going to turn it around. Well, that a lot of the same stuff is in place that was in place for him to have a really tough first year. So that would be a fascinating one. JSN, tricky in my mind in terms of the whole change in the offense and approach. And that's going to be another defensive oriented team. And I think if the Seahawks are good, they're going to be good through Mike McDonald's defense and then running the ball in Clint Kubiak's scheme and passing off of that some. But it's going to be tricky to be a really pass heavy team with a shaky O-line and a pressure sensitive quarterback in Sam Darnold, who's maybe not even that great. And Rashee Rice is an interesting one. I think we both still like him. And then we won't talk too much about them because you've told me you have about a 7,000 word piece that's coming out on the Kansas City Chiefs that people will have a chance to read coming up soon. T. Higgins at the top of the third round. You still have he was really efficient last year. He didn't play the full season. You still have the issue of him being a number 2 and very clearly being behind Chase. There's contingent upside, etc. The one name, as I go through it here again, that I haven't said is Tyreek Hill. And you were saying to me that you're getting a little bit more interested in him.
Well, I don't know if it's more interested. I've had an aggressive ranking on him that has made me uncomfortable because he's old, Ben. And
31.
Blair has such great research. He put it out in 2018. It looks at the 2000 to 2017 time period. what types of profile points are big concerns for guys, both in terms of leading to collapses, but then coming back from them. And there are a variety of guys who, I mean, last year had a lot of collapse players. We had quite a few injuries. And one of the things he discussed in the article is that injuries seem like no big deal. It's just like, well, you didn't score points because you couldn't play. But they're actually a pretty big concern. I'm not saying that even specifically about Hill, even though one of the issues he had was the wrist injury that made it harder for him probably to catch the ball, but also I think in some ways to be interested in getting open to catch the ball because you're dealing with that and just dragging on you all the time. I wanted to write about it a bit in this like 45 players piece. And so I did, again, another awesome thing from the screener, pulled up a bunch of the numbers for collapse guys from 2018 through 2024. And not surprisingly, basically everything that Blair was talking about had carried through for that time period as well, which, I mean, you're hoping is going to be the case because otherwise you put out something that like forward looking didn't actually work. The thing that jumped out to me with all of that was that age seemed to be an even bigger problem in this most recent time period than it had been from 2000 to 2017. And so when you're looking at some of these older guys like a Tyreek Hill, I think that's a concern. Now, a couple of things that I think are pretty intuitive, and it is how the pricing works, is that superstars, in part because they're coming down from such a high level, are more likely to come back. I mean, they're coming down from a high level and they're just good, right? They scored so many points because they're very different than other players to start with. If you look at a few of the big seasons that did happen for old players, it's basically just like Adam Thielen and then unbelievable superstars, right? Tyreek Hill is an unbelievable superstar. And so from that perspective, I'm not as worried about it. Basically, all of the really huge bounce back seasons were from superstars who were in that 23 to like 26 window who had been dealing with some type of an injury type of thing or a massive QB switch or something like that. So I'm basically not worried at all. And no one is, right? About guys who are 26 or younger who are superstars. You're like, yeah, just draft them like that's the case. For everybody else, a points collapse is a big deal. And the overwhelming likelihood is that soon they'll be out of the NFL. And so I was we didn't go into all of that, but I was kind of framing this for you. And that when I look at the prices for Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle, I'm seeing two different things where I can imagine an environment where everybody mostly stays healthy. Within that environment, I can see the Dolphins bouncing back and solving the problems they had last year. One of the things that I think is a little bit controversial, perhaps, and I always try and not push this too hard, but some of the other offenses that share similarities with the Dolphins, and obviously we're talking about a Shanahan tree-ish type of deal, they were significantly worse in 2024. And a lot of the biggest disappointments we had were from those style offenses. So I think we have a question about whether any of them create solutions to what happened last year. And then, I mean, it's a little bit of a symbiotic type of thing, or just a situation where I think if any of them solve the problem, they'll all be able to copy it and execute it. Now, maybe to different levels. But I think when you're looking at the Dolphins, you have this big problem with the offensive line. Kevin's written a great piece about how just their overall roster collapse is ongoing. And so that's a problem. I've talked earlier in the offseason how I'm still relatively bullish on the Dolphins. That probably was not correct, not the right way to be looking at it. So you have multiple levels of problems with Miami, even if Tua stays healthy. And then you have all of these scenarios where he doesn't stay healthy because, frankly, it's a big problem for them, right? Especially when you have a bad offensive line, but it's a problem. But you go through all of this and you're like, a bounce back, very possible. Tua, when he's healthy, plays very well. You've got one of the best offensive masterminds in the NFL. You have Tyreek Hill. You have Achane. You have this really pretty interesting chess piece in Jonnu Smith. But when we're trying to price all of these different scenarios and we're looking at what would happen in the positive side when things go well, then I do think that Tyreek Hill smashes a price in the middle of the third round. Probably doesn't get back to 1,700 yards, which he did in back-to-back seasons, but he's going to score like a first-round pick, even if it's like back of the first round. Jaylen Waddle also benefits, but Jaylen Waddle is so far down from Hill, and then probably also affected by guys like Achane and Smith taking so much of the target volume last year. That's a part that I would expect, even in positive scenarios, to be somewhat ongoing. Jaylen Waddle has huge injury problems, both from the perspective of staying healthy overall, but also just playing a lot of snaps in individual games. He's a guy who just isn't going to have a very high route share in almost all of the different ways that you look at this. And then I think because the Dolphins drafted him so early and then fed him so many targets early on, though we also get a little bit of a false baseline in terms of thinking about what he is. When you go back and look at him related to the other Alabama receivers, there were some real problems with both production and health in college. And then you look at the last two seasons, and the fantasy numbers there are not particularly good. So one of the things is, even though you've got a big split in price, I would be looking at this in that almost regardless of what happens, you're going to have Hill as a pretty big beneficiary of the good things, whereas Waddle maybe just like is able to hit ADP even in positive scenarios. Where then in negative scenarios, yeah, you probably wish you had drafted someone else than Tyreek Hill, but he's okay, right? In part because, I mean, again, he's Tyreek Hill. The things that made him collapse last year don't really seem to be age related in the way that you can point at that with a lot of guys and say, yeah, I mean, they're clearly declining, right? Whereas, I mean, Jaylen Waddle just doesn't seem like a good pick when you price out all the possible scenarios. Maybe that's not the right way to look at it, or maybe it's too specific to these two guys as opposed to putting Tyreek Hill within the context of round 3. But to me, when I have put the rankings together and I'm putting together my tactics for how I'm going to address individual rounds, but also individual teams, one of the things we've had pretty good success with in the past is having a sense of within teams, what's your best way to beat ADP and to create at least mildly asymmetrical outcomes where maybe one guy is a big win, small miss, and the other guy is the opposite thing. As I look through the profiles of the two players and think through how this Dolphins season can go, I end up pretty bullish on Hill at price, even with all of the red flags, where I'm still very concerned about Jaylen Waddle.
Yeah, and Waddle's price is fascinating. We talked about him at the end of the season, and I think it was on the air, but Waddle had a frustrating season last year. For people that it's been 6 months since then, they maybe don't remember it, but he frequently left games. As you mentioned, it goes back to like he never even had full routes at Alabama. Like he's always been a rotational player, somewhat sort of unreliable. I in my notes when I did my projection, I wrote he should be in his prime, and Tyreek is 31, but who's less reliable? And I mean, it's a rhetorical question, but I think it's pretty straightforward actually, because Waddle has been someone that's been really tough to depend on for the Dolphins, for fantasy managers, etc., because I think he's just going to be one of those guys that's going to be a little bit in and out, and you're going to get what you get out of him when you get those opportunities. And I think he's very talented when he's out there, but it would be a vast divergence from the majority of his career dating back into college if he were to actually run a lot of routes over the course of a full season and just stay healthy for the whole thing. I mean, that's just not really a thing that he's done. I mean, he did it a little bit in the very early stages of his pro career, and that was about it. But I think this is a really fascinating one to discuss because of McDaniel's system, which we know has been just fantastic for fantasy, even in a bad year. Last year, it made Jonnu an absolute star in the second half. In the final, I think it was 9 games he had, final 8 games, double figures in PPR, and all 8, 19 plus in PPR in 5 of those. So in tight end premium, obviously even more. And Devon Achane has 10 more receptions than any other running back in the NFL, which is And that's despite the fact, by the way, that Achane averaged 6.1 receptions per game in 2 is 11 games and only 1.8 in the 6 games Tua missed. I mean, if Tua plays a little bit more based on those splits, it's not hard to be like Achane could have won the running back receptions crown by like 30. And this gets back to the thing with McDaniel's system where he gets the ball where he wants to get it to. He wasn't able to do it as much with Tyreek and Waddle last year, but he did it with Achane and then eventually with Jonnu, who only had 9 catches in the first 4 games to start the year, but then was a part of the inner circle. And once you're a part of the inner circle, it's fantastic. One of the other notes I had is that you can kind of view Hill and Waddle interchangeably in the sense that you could use either's poor 2024 to talk about the other's 2025 rebound. You could say that Hill looked like he's over the hill or something, and that is why Waddle, still in his prime, has a real chance in 2025. But I think I go the other way, the way that you go as well, which is Waddle not stepping up last year in a year where Hill was hurt the whole season and was really struggling to produce, to me is more of a red flag that he's just sort of not capable or not necessarily going to be able to step into a huge role, even if it's there from a reliability standpoint, if you will. Hill's been incredibly reliable every year of his career up until this last year, at least on the football field. Waddle having the really poor season last year could also be sort of the start of the end. I mean, I know that's kind of weird to say, but he struggled the last couple of years, and there's precedent for players to come in and be very good in their first couple of years and then kind of never be that good again. I mean, Juju Smith-Schuster immediately comes to mind. Hakeem Nicks was mostly injury related, but he comes to mind from back in the day. That was always one of the old examples, but there's more examples. Like, it is not, football careers are different. It's bizarre to me that Waddle is going in the 5th round on Underdog, the 6th round on FFPC. He's going ahead of a lot of the receivers that we actually like in that range that we've talked about. I mean, one guy I really like in that range is Chris Olave going in the next round. I mean, Chris Olave's had a bunch of concussion issues. You could talk about whether he's going to be, able to be relied on, et cetera. But it's so straightforward for me that he would be ahead of Waddle, I guess. And then there's other guys in that round that you really like, Jerry Jeudy, Jordan Addison, some of these other names. I mean, there's just I don't know how Waddle's going ahead of any of those names. In the beginning of the offseason, he was going in like the 8th round in the very earliest drafts. And I remember saying to you, I think said to me at one point, you're like, I don't know if I can draft Jaylen Waddle ever again. It was in December or something. But the drafts had already kind of started. And I think I said to you, whenever this was, I mean, buckle up because he's going in the 8th round. Like, we might have to take some Waddle. And we talked about that a little bit, but that's not the price that you're getting. If that was the price that you were getting, then you could make the bet on everything that we've seen from Waddle up to this point and where he's at and how his 2024 went. It's really hard to make that bet 3 rounds higher in the 5th round or the 6th round.
Then I selected Luther Burden in the middle of the 12th round of the MFL 10 of Death. I think once Burden is off the board is where I would feel comfortable grabbing a Jaylen Waddle.
There you go. So you're pushing him even further. But this is an offense that we want to target. And so if you feel that way about Waddle, if you agree with sort of what both Shawn and I are saying here, if you go back and look at 2022 and 2023, you mentioned that both these guys have their routes kind of cold, but Hill was over a 3 yards per out run in both those years. Waddle was over 2.5 in both those years, but not over 3. I mean, he was good. And then Waddle was way down to 1.53 in 2024. Hill was way down to 1.75, but meaningfully better than Waddle still last year as well on a per route basis. Both of them obviously
they're just not
very
real,
banged
I mean,
up,
they're not
really
remotely
struggled,
similar
had some
players.
issues throughout the season. But if you want to be back in on this offense, I do think, as I went through the projection, there's still a lot of upside. There's still a lot of opportunity here for me. I mean, I had Tyreek Hill projected actually for a couple fewer targets than Garrett Wilson, and yet 25 additional points just based on how the efficiency and everything comes out as far as PPR fantasy points. And so, I mean, and Hill's going behind Wilson. So you start talking about that kind of baseline projection math, what have you, in the 3rd round. Not everyone's projections are going to look identical, but more to the point was that point I was making about the 3rd round being around. You need to think that this guy has real ceiling. And that's the part of it where it's really straightforward with Hill. I was talking about how with Garrett Wilson, I have a hard time seeing, I think he can be a small win. I have a hard time seeing how he's a big win at cost in the 3rd round. Tyreek Hill, it's just do what you did in 2023, do what you did in 2022, be the guy that was the reason that you were a top 5 pick last year. Now you're going in the 3rd round in a really tough range of drafts. I don't want to be taking him on every single team, but he does look like that name. I mentioned to you when we started talking about him this morning, when I did that show with Column, picking my favorite player in each round, when I took the 4th round player, the one, if you made me stay within the lines of the 3rd round, the one guy that I was strongly considering sticking with was Tyreek. I mean, I think it's fairly straightforward to look at his profile and say, yeah, I mean, he's kind of over the hill, but if it's a 1-year blip and he's able to rebound a little this year, and we've seen guys do that. You mentioned it's been a little tougher for older guys to produce, but we saw when Keenan Allen had his first blip, he bounced back, and we were in on him a couple of years ago as a result, and he had a great season as like I think it was a 3rd round pick in the end. It was like a 5th round pick early in the offseason, wound up being about a 3rd round pick. We also saw Mike Evans go through a similar progression around that time where he had a little bit of a dip in some of his production. It maybe wasn't as serious, but that he was able to rebound. I think that's fascinating. The other area, or the other players in this 3rd round that I think are fascinating, are the elite quarterbacks. And if it is this flat, and if Tyreek Hill doesn't hit, and if the other guys don't have real ceiling, are there any other players in that range that pique your interest?
So as we look at these receivers, one of the things that jumps out to me, it's pretty interesting, even just looking at, very recent drafts, the FFPC Best Ball Tournament, Davante Adams, as you mentioned earlier on the show, is going at the 401 as the wide receiver 18. In the combo of the main event and the big gorilla, which are the FFPC redraft contests that are drafting right now, Davante Adams is actually going at wide receiver 14 at the 305. He went as the wide receiver 16 at the 305 in the NFL 10 of Death. So certainly lots of people are considering him kind of in that range. So he's an interesting name. And then the other name, a guy that we've liked, and we said at several points that we were a little bit concerned about him for this year, but then when he fell to us at the 310, we did kind of race to the podium or what have you and select Jackson Smith and Jigba in our main event. I don't think people are going to get too many shots of him at the 310, although in redraft, you do have a little bit more of a range sometimes. At least that's been my experience. Let's start with JSN, the guy that we like here. This is a player who made the jump last year, still is kind of in that range where he needs to take a secondary jump to really be what we want and to be, I think, a viable pick here even before you start to consider context. And by viable pick, I mean someone where we're talking about how next year, if things go well, you finish 3 seasons, you're in your peak, you came in young, you're going to be a 1-2 turn pick guy. He himself needs to take a jump, but then you also have this context, which is he's playing for Seattle, as you mentioned. We're going to have a run-heavy team. We're probably going to have poor quarterback play from Sam Darnold. It is kind of interesting and fun. You do, even though it doesn't fix the problem, you do like to hear the guys who have some self-awareness, and Sam Darnold is out there telling people, I played poorly at the end of last year, week 18, the playoffs. I have to play better than that. I've got to continue to improve. And one of the things for Sam Darnold is that he did get a decent run with the Jets, but he's not someone who has got so many NFL starting games that you're looking at him and saying he's completely finished as a product. There's no way, no possible way Sam Darnold could ever get a little bit better. And I think in his defense, that if you get good coordinating around him, that if he gets a little bit better, because his results before the meltdown at the very end last year, I mean, you would watch those Minnesota Vikings games and say, wow, if they had a dynamic QB, what Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and TJ Hawkinson are doing to opponents would be silly. It would be so cool. But instead, they have Sam Darnold. The fact of the matter is, though, that they did have him, and he played reasonably well if you look at the full season numbers. So my question would be, how much am I overstating my concern about volume and my concern about Sam Darnold's play, and not pricing all of the scenarios. One of the things that I usually, when you see prices on players that you disagree with, then your thought to yourself is, okay, the fantasy community is pricing this scenario and this scenario. And obviously there are lots of scenarios. They're pricing most of these, but they're not pricing correctly or really thinking through one of the ones that is pretty important, either because it's realistic and it's either so high end or so low end, or it's just much more likely to happen than people are thinking. Either of those things can be the reason that the pricing is wrong. I'm wondering if I'm not considering scenarios where Darnold is okay, and either because he's okay or because of game script or because he's okay and Jackson Smith and Jigba is absolutely awesome, that he does take that step, that we actually get pretty good volume from the Seahawks passing offense. We get pretty decent efficiency, especially when targeted at Jackson Smith and Jigba. And then JSN has a really high target share. One of the things that did kind of jump out to me as I was, again, looking through these sort of recent results on players who've collapsed and then what happened subsequently, is that the rate of bounce back, I think, is still lower than people have it intuitively. And I talked about how it's easier for stars, but even for those guys, especially when they're old, right? Because they're just not the same person, that the bounce back level is lower than what's intuitive for us. And so when I look at Deebo Samuel and Stephon Diggs and Cooper Kupp, I'm saying fading them at those prices is certainly not guaranteed to work. I mean, nothing is guaranteed, but anybody who's taking those guys and likes them, I'm perfectly fine with that. For me, I'm also fine with where I am, which is I just don't think that you want to have very much exposure to them. The history doesn't suggest that you would want exposure to them. I mean, what they did last year doesn't suggest you would want much. And then history kind of confirms that intuition that, yeah, this is not a good situation to then say this is going to be a bounce back. Well, if that's the case, and Cooper Kupp is not a legitimate threat to JSN, that he's not really going to be a sidekick, he's going to be more of a role player, and that JSN is kind of in the same situation that we've talked about for Garrett Wilson, and then the other player that we were talking about probably should be in that 16, should make it a 17, maybe even. I mean, then I was writing up Kyle Pitts, and you dive into the situation with the Falcons, and he was basically benched last year. Now, benched from the perspective of his snap share was no longer like remotely starter share at the end of the season. But you're looking at the team, you're like, who's going to catch the ball? They basically just have Drake London. So I'm now thinking that Drake London is going to lead the NFL in targets, and there's a limit to how bad you can be if you lead the NFL in targets when you're a pretty straightforward pick. But Garrett Wilson, Jackson Smith, and Jigba, other guys who, when we're looking at these early rounds, that's a little bit almost like the situation with Ladd McConkey last year. Now, I don't want this to be an anti-McConkey thing where I'm like trying to subsequently push the idea that he wasn't good. He was fantastic. But if your team has nobody else, then both in terms of just the way the math works out, but also the psychology of the play caller, the psychology of the quarterback, when you're the guy and when the other person, and you even think about, the huge targets that Quentin Johnston got in the kind of one-off game at the end of the season, when there's a context in place where Quentin Johnston could have that number of targets, he's the other guy. When you think about how every time Justin Herbert drops back, it's like, I mean, I definitely want to know where Ladd McConkey is because I do not want to throw it to anybody else. There's a structural difference a little bit with the Garrett Wilson thing, but we both are pretty high on what he can do within the context of a low volume passing offense. Could we get that for a JSN?
I have concerns. I want to note on your London comment that, yeah, that was one that we had talked about earlier. And for people who had listened to the RotoViz radio or will listen to it, I talked about him a little bit on that podcast with Colin. But when I went through my projections, I was telling you that, or I'm not done with them yet, but about halfway done, I have like 17 more targets for London than any other number one in the league. I haven't done Chase or Jefferson or CeeDee Lamb, a number of the top receivers yet, but I have Nico Collins done, Brian Thomas, Tyreek Hill, AJ Brown, Garrett Wilson. A lot of these guys are in the 140s. I have Drake London projected for 159 targets. And you were saying to me, I mean, he's going to get 200 targets because the competition there is just very weak. The gap that has opened up between him and Pitts now that wasn't clear going into last year, but is clear now. Pitts not even necessarily running all the routes, but probably also from a talent perspective, not being there. Mooney being a very routes dependent producer last year, was not a huge target earner. But this is an offense that we knew this coming over from the Rams last year. I talked about it a lot last year. I expected it, at least didn't know it, but that they were going to be very 11 personnel heavy, be very high on the snap shares and the volume distribution toward their typical 11 personnel at the skill positions, which if you go look at the Falcons full season numbers last year, they're like number 3 running back, barely touched the ball. They've since cut him. Jason McClellan. Bijan basically dominated everything, and then Algier was basically the only other guy. And then in the passing game, it really was just Drake London and Darnell Mooney, and then Ray McLeod was their slot guy. They rotated in Kadero Hodge just a little bit. He famously had a overtime game winner touchdown in like week 5, but I was surprised to find, looking into it, that Hodge as their 4th receiver only had like 15 targets all year. I mean, like, it's just a hyper concentrated. The routes are hyper concentrated. McLeod had 500 plus routes out of the slot, which is crazy. And when you get that situation and no one else is a big target earner, London's overall numbers last year, a breakout season for him. His career high yards per out run matched his career high targets per out with a career high route run number, because his previous high targets per out was in one of those low route run Arthur Smith offenses. So he gets more volume, but he maintains the high rate at more volume. And then you're coming back this year and you're saying, okay, that was all with Kirk Cousins. The efficiency was there as well, but he was having a really hard time driving the ball. I'm not saying Penix is definitely going to be better, but this is one of those situations where you had a veteran quarterback who was not throwing the ball effectively. And now going to a young quarterback may actually be a boost rather than our immediate thought that it's going to hold players back. And really where Penix throws the ball effectively is into the intermediate ranges where London wins. And it's just he's going to get so many target shot. I mean, like, what's that?
The Falcons were a team that needed to add at the receiver position.
They
didn't. And now they're a frontline guy. The Seahawks were a team that needed to add after they got rid of everybody and they added Cooper Kupp. You said you had concern. I mean, JSN isn't going to be this year's Drake London.
Yeah, sorry. I went into the whole London thing because I did say at the top that we would talk a little bit about that other guy that we really like in the middle of the second round, or even higher than that, but that's where he's going in most formats, although I think an Underdog a little higher. JSN, the concerns for me are that, as you were talking through, like, is there the possibility they throw a little bit more than this, that, and the other thing? Essentially, the reason that they fired Ryan Grubb was because he called too many pass plays. But it was extreme. That's one of the things, too, that when you go back through it, it feels more extreme when you look at the numbers than it felt watching them. Well, when you're watching them, and it keeps going back to like this. We really like him. I think one of the most fascinating people in 2025 is just very straightforwardly Kenneth Walker, who is the ultimate caricature of a running back, where, I mean, before last season, he was there in training camp, and even without pads, he looks like a Terminator, right? He's got incredible long speed. He crushed the NFL in evasion rate, and yet he didn't gain any yards, in part because part of the character, he just spends the whole time doing like, the little kids thing where you run to one side of the field, all the defense is there. You're like, okay, I'll just reverse field and run. You're like, that doesn't happen at the NFL level, but Kenneth Walker tries it. So he gets all of these weird results. When the Seahawks guys have to dodge that many defenders in the backfield, then any coordinator who understands that passing is more efficient anyway is like, what I'm going to call? I'm going to call a pass play. We're going to try and go score some points. But, I mean, will we not land in the middle if Clint Kubiak actually designs and executes an effective offense? I mean, and maybe not the middle, right? But not at the very bottom. I mean, my fear is the bottom, and that's where I've been kind of evaluating. I think JSN, yeah. I think JSN's draftable, to be clear. Like, I mean, I kind of made the case that Garrett Wilson's not, because of some of those situational things where he'd really have to consolidate like DJ Moore and be really efficient like DJ Moore's spike. And those things are really tough to do. And even then, DJ Moore was not like the number one wide receiver one overall that year. He was a couple years ago. He was like wide receiver 6 on the season. It was good. And it was a win, but it wasn't a massive win. And that was in addition to him having like a 50-point game against the Washington Commanders, who had some terrible cornerback play, especially at that point in the season that year. But anyway, that was the concern about Garrett Wilson. I do think JSN is draftable. I think the key notes on JSN are like after DK Metcalf's week 7 injury is when JSN really starts to come on. He posts a 2.35 yards per out run over his final 11 games, well up from his full season numbers. He plays at a higher ADOT last year, almost 3 yards deeper. And then the cup stuff that you were talking about, his yak per reception had cratered. His missed tackles for stuff cratered. Yards per target wasn't necessarily horrible, but he just wasn't the same guy. The catch rate has been really down the last couple of years, which I think goes to the fact that he's just not creating easy separation. The Rams did not want him back, even though I think on the personal level, the off-field level, they really, really liked this person, him and Stafford, breakfast buddies. Him and Sean McVay are apparently really close, Cup that is. And yet the Rams were like, look, there's basically no way we can have you back because we don't think you're good anymore.
That was one of the things that jumped out to me when I was looking through some of this, is like just how tight Cup was with some of those folks, which, I mean, it's hard to tell. It's basically impossible to tell your friends, like, you're not good enough at the stuff that we do together. We're going to get somebody else. I mean, you've got to be pretty confident.
Yeah, that's tough, which means that you're probably thinking about JSN as having the potential to really run away with the target share in his offense as well, as you're saying. And like, for example, in my projections, I'm not necessarily projecting it that way because it's a little trickier to do in a Seattle projection. And so I think there's meat on the bone from my projection for JSN. But I do think when you think about the range of outcomes, and you think about the fact that they fired Grubb for the reasons that they did, and they brought in Clint Kubiak, when you think about what Clint Kubiak actually did in New Orleans, especially before all the injuries hit in the early part of the year, now it's a very small sample, but like week 1 against Carolina, they go out, they run the ball really effectively, and they win a game. They threw the ball 24 times. They ran it 37 times. They were like, we're just going to run the ball every single time. Chris Olave got 2 targets in that first game in week 1. And Olave is the guy I would point to as being similar to JSN. I think JSN's better and has more ceiling. They played together at Ohio State, and JSN was better on the same field. But Olave had a couple games in his 6 full games under Clint Kubiak last year, and obviously small sample. He had a couple games where he had a 14-target game, a 10-target game. But the other 4 games, 6, 4, and 2, a lot of it was because of a really heavy run rate. They really want to be run focused. A lot of it was also because a lot of their passing game was based off the run, play action, like first read Foster Moreau on a leak play, first read Rashid Shaheed going deep. I was in Olave last year too, and it was frustrating to watch the inability for him to just win targets on normal routes, drop back routes. He would get some actual first read looks as well because it's a key part of their offense. They do play action deep over routes and hit him on the run, and I know he had some big plays doing that. But I think what we saw from the passing game that he devised as well is because it's a based off the run game, that it didn't even like allow for the number one to dominate the target share the way that, like I was talking about the RPO game or whatever in a Jets offense might. And so that's my other concern is, okay, Darnold may bounce back. Maybe a lot of these other things work out. Yes, I do think JSN from a big picture perspective was so good last year, particularly when you give him a little bit of a pass in the first 5 or 6 weeks where the whole team stuff was a little weird. Their routes run were really, really high. They had a ton of dropbacks. It called a ton of pass plays. And DK Metcalf was being really treated as the focal point. And then Metcalf gets hurt, and there's a little bit more, okay, JSN, what can you do for us? And he breaks out, basically, the rest of the way. If you look at it from that perspective, I think you're like, I mean, he was a 21-year-old rookie the year before in a horribly devised offense by Shane Waldron. 22-year-old mid-season or early season, he really takes off and breaks out for the second 2/3 of the season. I think you can look at that and say, okay, going forward into year 3, he's still very young. This guy's a really good wide receiver, and I think he's going to be good long-term. And I think you can make some cases for Darnold that you made. I'm concerned about the overall structure of the offense, the desire to be run heavy, the fact that I do think Mike McDonald's a good defensive coach, and if Seattle's good at all, I think it's because in year 2 under his system, if he gets a lot of buy-in, he creates a really good defensive team again that then is a run-based, defensive-based team trying to win low-scoring games. They have talked about using Jalen Milroe in specific packages. The Ravens, in early career Lamar Jackson with Joe Flacco there, they used him. They're actually one of the teams that did that effectively, used a mobile quarterback to a pretty significant degree. Lamar Jackson didn't throw a lot until very late in that rookie season, but he was running.
That year was crazy. Now, and I think that's one of my concerns as well. It's one of the reasons why I basically don't draft Sam Darnold anywhere. Like, even if I desperately need a quarterback, because of this issue where that pattern has a really good chance of occurring again. And that's in no way, shape, or form saying that Jalen Milroe is Lamar Jackson, because he is definitely not. No. But the NFL has changed a lot since that point too. If Lamar Jackson was drafted now, he would not have had to wait till that point to play in his rookie year. He would have been allowed to pass some in his rookie year. We would have gotten the whole thing sooner. Milroe is more the type of prospect who would actually make sense to do with what the Ravens did with Lamar Jackson.
Yeah. And Mike McDonald, for the record, was already an assistant on the Ravens at that time. I just pulled it up to confirm, but he was their linebackers coach in 2018. And he's been talking this offseason like he very much remembers that first year plan with Lamar Jackson and thought that added something and they want to do that. And I think, again, the mobility thing and the running thing, I think for him is really, really important. I'm really into Kenneth Walker. The take that I came to guest podding as a guest on Neil Orfield's podcast recently was that the offensive change could be for Kenneth Walker a little bit like what the team change was for Saquon Barkley last year. Not maybe to the entire degree, but what we saw for Barkley was this. He's obviously a very good runner, and we've talked a lot about how good runners are also deserve credit for yards before contact. It's not just about blocking, but he never really had that with the Giants. He's always trying to make plays in the backfield. They're always stacking the box, all that stuff. He finally, with the Eagles, gets into a good running scheme where they're creating space for him to get, and now he has to make his move on the second level of defenders 5 yards downfield to get an explosive play. And he starts showing that, yeah, I can create all sorts of explosive plays if you give me opportunities to get into home run hitting situations where I'm running downhill 5 yards beyond the line of scrimmage before I'm ever touched. Kenneth Walker last year's missed tackle forced and evasion stuff was absolutely absurd. But yet he had the lowest yards before contact rate in the league. It's not purely an offensive line stat. He does run side to side, but if they get this outside zone scheme running in a way that it won't be as good because they don't have the offensive line the Eagles have. But if they get it in a way that allows Kenneth Walker to get 5 yards downfield untouched sometimes, right? That's that kind of the idea of the outside zone running scheme, and lets him make his move where he doesn't have to break a bunch of tackles in the backfield and start to run laterally and get into his own issues. He can hit downhill a little bit and then make his move downfield. I think you can start to get those big plays again, like the Barkley plays. And so
and I thought we had an agreement on discussing things that would affect Kenneth Walker's ADP. What about some of these guys?
I can't stop talking about
that no one is going to be in on. I wanted to kind of, as we wrap things up, I mentioned a bunch of names at the beginning. You said these guys are in the 4th round or the 5th round. I do think that for me, part of the issue with round 3 is that wide receiver is so bad also in round 4. And that you can't, it gets a little bit awkward if you're pulling up the exact same guy every time, if you're talking about a best ball portfolio, or if you're thinking about your, big gorilla structure and you're thinking like, how can I get value? Now we've done the content on why we've selected the elite QB, especially in managed formats where you're not going to get the optimization benefits. You're simply going to get the score from your stars, and why that might work there. If you are trying to execute either a 0 RB-ish type of build, or you started running back, you do feel like for whatever reason you need to make some picks at receiver in this range. I kind of had promised Devontae Adams. I mean, he was really good again, and they're talking about how good he looks for the Rams. For me, it's a problem of, I guess I've soured on both him coming to like to the point where I'm just okay with the fact that he was really good again last year. It doesn't do a lot for me, for him at his price, but it does make me pull back on Puka, who I previously had thought, you could pick as high as like 103. Now I don't even really feel like you can pick Puka in the first round. Again, because of some of these other guys. It's not saying like he couldn't hit. Obviously, he's been unbelievable through 2 seasons. But, I mean, guys like Terry McLaurin, the big plays, Jaden Daniels, having some other guys, just it's going to be even more Jaden Daniels-centric. I mean, maybe that's one that works, but even when a guy like Terry McLaurin hits, like, what do you get? Mike Evans. I mean, it's just been crazy. I pointed out to you all of the stuff about Emeka Egbuka and how when he gets the ball, he looks like a running back. Maybe the guy in charge of charting Ohio State, however SIS does it, like maybe those people really didn't like Egbuka, but none of that comes out, right? So I just do want to kind of stipulate that. But when you think about the kind of rhetoric that is coming out of Buccaneers practice about Egbuka, you think about someone like a Mike Evans, you think about Chris Godwin, you think about Jalen McMillan. I mean, what do you win if Mike Evans is the nominal number 1 for them this year? DJ Moore, the team has gone out of their way to advertise the fact that they have been criticizing him a ton in both public and private for his behavior last year. They've got all these other guys. What do you win even if Caleb Williams takes a jump? Xavier Worthy is obviously, people kind of know where we are with that, some risk reward there. I mean, DK Metcalf, everybody's reporting on how much Aaron Rodgers is going to hate him because of the bad routes. You move back through, to round 5, and again, the young guys. Like, I'm a pretty big Hunter skeptic purely from a receiving perspective, purely as a wide receiver. I mean, so much of what he is this combo, right? And especially when you have Brian Thomas on your roster. And yet I look at Travis Hunter and like, I feel like I'm both a skeptic and I want him about 5 spots ahead of his current positional rank, just because there's some range of outcome here compared to these other guys. And in Cortland Sutton, we're talking deep in round 5 in some formats now, but what do you win if you get Cortland Sutton right? They're talking, I mean, we think that Pat Bryant is really good. I mean, that take could go anywhere, right? I mean, it could be one of those where like, oh, we got Michael Thomas out of good prices. It's more likely that like no one remembers Pat Bryant in a couple months because Marvin Harrison's doing a lot, because Troy Franklin has taken a step forward. Troy Franklin, a stealth, like really good breakout candidate who just doesn't ever get drafted anywhere. They've got the tight end now. They're going to throw a ton of passes to RJ Harvey. Like, what do you get if you're right on Cortland Sutton? And so, I mean, as we look at this structure, or we look at this environment, this landscape from rounds 3 to round 5, it feels of a piece to me where this whole thing is tough. It's tricky.
Sutton was wide receiver 28, or is wide receiver 28 in ADP. I think he said he was wide receiver 15 last year with 8 touchdowns on 135 targets, just over 1,000 yards. I think what you get is right there. You get last year. I think last year was more or less it's not the 100th percentile outcome, the pure ceiling or anything, but it was pretty close. I mean, it was I think that's one of the things I talked about over the years where people have a hard time thinking through range of outcomes and past outcomes. Like Cortland Sutton hit his 75th, 80th percentile last year. That's what it is. And now he's priced like it. And you have to realize that there's not meat on that bone, really. There's not a whole lot there in the way that offense is run. I think you talked to a lot of other guys there very effectively. The one I want to talk about is Adams. You said twice that he was really good last year. I'm just going to say he wasn't. I think you're forgetting the season. He had a couple of long touchdowns late in the year against with the Jets. Caught a couple long TDs and then had a catch and run long touchdown in that massive game against the Jaguars where he had a long reception and then also a slant. He can still play. Clearly, I wrote this in my targets per out run piece at the end of the year. I was kind of forgetting it too, Sean, but I read back to that stuff that I wrote right at the end of the year. And I was writing I'd be very skeptical of him at age 32, that there was a force-fed nature to some of his targets after he came over to the Jets, and yet his targets per out run still fell to his lowest figure since 2018, 25.9%, still very good, but it was up around 30% typically. His yards per target efficiency was also down, despite the fact that he hit on these big plays. Well, it wasn't down from 2023, which was even worse. His last 2 years have both been bad, but it was down from 2022 and earlier when he had meaningfully higher yards per target figures. And so you get him hitting on a few big plays with the Jets and getting a few more sort of like almost force-fed targets, it felt like, or that's the way that I described it, as he was playing with Rodgers late in the season. And I'm not saying like he's bad, but I knowing you and knowing the way that I'm pretty sure at the end of the year, you were like, Devonta Adams is not playing well when we were talking through it, but he's just had a few lucky high scoring games. So I'm mainly saying that from the perspective that I think old Shawn 6 months ago doesn't agree with current Shawn here in June, that it's one of those guys that you've memory hold a little bit. I think you can see production still. What I wrote is at the end of this paragraph that I wrote back in January, you're talking about a similar decline to stuff we've seen from guys like Keenan Allen, Cooper Kupp, and Adam Thielen, with an important point being that all of them still did find ways to earn decent volume and stretches as they declined. What's most notable, though, is how the ceiling goes. My point was you had these route running guys that didn't have the ceiling anymore. They still found ways to be productive. I think Adams could find ways to be productive. I have a really hard time with him having a real ceiling. Other than the fact that like basically everyone in the Rams offense seems to, and Matthew Stafford's like every receiver that has ever played with Matthew Stafford's been a superstar. So probably Adams is going to wind up being one. But I don't think it's because of what he did last year.
Part of my take on Adams is that I do think putting up some of the impressive target-related elements of being able to generate the points, the targets, the 1,000-yard season, the 8 TD season, when you're competing with Garrett Wilson in a terrible offense. So there's the Aaron Rodgers stuff kind of cuts both ways, where like the only reason that he's out competing Garrett Wilson during this stretch in some cases is simply because Aaron Rodgers doesn't want Garrett Wilson to be good, and he does want Devonta Adams to be good. And that same dynamic will not exist, obviously, on any other team. It's not going to exist for the Rams. Puka Nacua is going to step on his production, and he cannot be drafted in round 3. But I think that he's still closer to what he was than, say 6 months ago, Shawn Siegele. He's closer to what he was than I was willing to give him credit for at that point. And so this is kind of another interesting one. I was telling you, I do think that one of the outcomes of this Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy debate is that partly, like if you feel like you have a strong stake in this either way, the easiest way to exploit it is to take Patrick Mahomes.
Yeah.
I've been pretty skeptical of Matthew Stafford because during a lot of this stretch with the Rams, they have either refused to throw or not thrown as effectively as like the peak Matthew Stafford would have done. I mean, Matthew Stafford had some amazing seasons, and you go and look at some of the recent stuff. Now, one of the things that has happened to him to an extent is that some of these guys have gotten hurt, right? And so if you have fully healthy seasons from Cooper Kupp, he's going to look different. If you have fully healthy seasons last year from Puka Nacua, things are going to look different. But I mean, we're talking about a guy in Matthew Stafford who in that 2021 season, right, threw for almost 4,900 yards. We're talking about somebody who back in the 16 game seasons hit 5,000 yards and also had another season that just missed that. And then the most recent 3 seasons, he hasn't hit 4,000. Now, one of those he just plays in the 9 games. But I guess a little bit of what I'm thinking here, and every year I'm like, okay, I'm going to draft the elite quarterbacks, and then every year I get caught up in, well, there are these scenarios for the cheap QBs that are actually pretty viable. I think that the Rams are going to break back out as a passing offense in 2025. I think that's one of the main reasons that you do go and make this very controversial swap of Cup for Adams. I know that he's not really priced like he's going to have a redraft impact, but I do think that Terrence Ferguson is going to be good. He's going to be a real part in a way that they haven't had previously. I also think that the move potentially to Jarquez Hunter, I love Kyron Williams. I think his story is cool. I was adamant you had to draft him last year. It kind of worked out from a fantasy perspective, but he just really wasn't very good. And I think that part of what they're looking to do is to actually just be more explosive and not have so much of the run lean that they've had at different times during the McVay era, and or that some of those touches become, Jarquez Hunter or screen passes, what have you.
Yeah.
And you start to really stack that stuff up, even if the impact of Davante Adams is not some massive statistical impact. I think that we could see the Rams passing offense and Matthew Stafford be pretty interesting this year.
Yeah, and in those cases, I think Adams can be. I mean, he'll be I like I said, and even in my write-up, I wrote that he still has plenty left in the tank. Basically, I don't think he's done. I guess I just don't think that the ceiling is actually there. I don't think he was the same player last year, even when he was making those plays with the Jets. I remember watching him. He's never been the most athletic guy. He's been a very quick and good route runner, but not like the straight line speed necessarily, faster than anybody on the field type of athleticism. But even on those long touchdowns, it's I don't know. I guess I felt that he looked a little old, but that's not the whole story.
He and Amari Cooper are both like, we're going to knock you guys out of fantasy tournaments right up until like the day before the last day we're in the NFL. It's like one day we were completely done. The day before that, we knocked you out of all of the tournaments.
That's right. He's had the monster games that have been killer if you didn't have him at the right time the last couple of years. And he's, very accomplished player. But yeah, I have a hard time with his price after the 2 years of yards per target type, after the target efficiency decline, the clear targets per route decline last year, even with the season with Rodgers. And then now changing teams for a third time. I don't know. Stafford's if the passing game is as good as you say, and they don't run as much, and they do kind of lean that way, and Stafford as a quarterback has been really good for wide receivers over the years. That's the part of it that and the McVay offense has really concentrated the volume where it wants to go. And very similar to what we were talking about with Tyreek Hill and the Dolphins offense earlier. So it's plausible that I'm missing the boat there. I'm not like entirely out on the idea of Davante Adams, but I do think he's in decline, and that's the part that's tricky.
Well, Ben, we've tried to cover some of the guys who maybe aren't our targets. Want to get all of these guys discussed as we work through the offseason here, as you work through your projections. I'm always excited. I don't ever want us to do any content that sort of overlaps with in any negative way with the fantastic shows that you and Mike Leone are doing. I am always excited for that time period once you guys are like fully wrapped up and I can look through your targets with you and your projections and grill you a bit. Say, these are the 3 or 4 that I don't get that part. That show is always a good time. Again, check out. I
just got to get through more projections, and then we'll do that as soon as I get them done.
There you go. Check out your appearance with Colin Kelly on the RotoViz Fantasy Football Show. He was really excited about those. Get some of Ben's favorite picks in every round. Make sure you're subscribed to Stealing Signals. The way to do that is go to bengretch.substack.com. Love to have you guys over at RotoViz. You can use the coupon code RVRadio2025 at checkout for 10% off your 1-year sub. Yeah, this has been Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn with Ben. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.